Thank you very much to our speakers. I know we just clapped for Cara, but perhaps we could just give them all a round of applause again, please. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? Before we start, can you just introduce yourselves and tell us who the question is for, whether it's individuals or all of them, and we'll take 3 questions at a time and try and answer them that way. Very quiet. Well, I have a question, as always. Oh, sorry, there's someone there has a question. Sorry.
Richard Tong, Dean of Cardiff School of Sport. Just a question about how do you get people to own their values, do you think? What are the best ways of either creating values or getting the values actually owned by staff?
Yeah, I think we'll start as we haven't any other questions at the moment. So,
I mean, a little bit more detail on values and what I didn't say. I think there are 3 sets of values, really. There are the values that we might attribute to roles in public life, the Nolan principles, and I think we might take it as read that we all live and work by those values. I then think there are values that are sector-wide, or at least we claim they're sector-wide, and we do talk about those, so academic freedom, research ethics, those kinds of things. And then I think there are some values that are institution-specific, and those are sometimes the ones that it's easier to get people to talk about. What is it that's distinctive about our institution? What do we believe in? What's the difference that we're trying to make? And a good place to start that discussion is through a very consultative strategic planning process, the kind that we're just about to embark on. But I would say that it's really important that those discussions are held embodying the principles of openness, transparency, honesty, and so on, because sometimes we claim values that we're not actually living out. And I was really struck, just a small anecdote. 2 weeks ago, a former colleague of mine from Edinburgh University, who shall remain nameless, but it would not be difficult to find out who this is. And the reason it wouldn't be difficult is she let me know that she had just been appointed to a professorship at the University of Warwick. And I was delighted because this was an outstanding colleague who was absolutely worthy of a professorship. That was the good news. The not so good news for all of us that claim that we promote and champion the value of equality and diversity is that she is either the 18th or 19th black woman professor in the UK. And that makes me feel actually quite ashamed of the work that we do in this sector. So I think it's about authenticity, having the honest conversations, making room for those conversations, challenging ourselves, acknowledging that we haven't got it all right, there is still a long way to go, and seeing that as a really important part of our role. It's as important as measuring other KPIs that might be about other issues like finance and so on.
Yeah, what occurs to me is that in some ways, the more difficult thing is putting the question the other way around. How do members of the university get us to live their values? Which is really where I think the disconnect can easily happen, because in a leadership, you're often under a set of pressures that's quite difficult to convey, and that you can't ignore, and that sometimes, you get driven down a line where people think, well, you're only interested in getting students in because you need to balance the books, or we're dropping standards, or whatever else it might be. And I think that's the real challenge, is how we can live up to the real ideal of a university, which I think people out there absolutely want, and we see that all the time. So how do we manage the kind of pressures that are on us to make that happen? This business is not easy. I mean, we've spent at least a year now talking through, can we have a value, can you have an authentic, a genuine values-led strategy? Because the problem is, if you do start putting values up in lights and going down that route, then it can easily become a hostage to fortune. You do something, well, that's not the way what you've said about the values, it doesn't fit in with that. And on the other hand, if you're able to have those open and honest conversations about those occasions or those matters, then I think it is enriching, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've got anything to add in terms of, I think my experience has been it's tough. And I'll come back to the honesty. I think we have to find ways that actually we're having those honest conversations, because actually that way you're starting to unpack where you are, and you have to almost obsessionally live with what are we expecting for here? What's it like to be here? You know, Cara's right, there are various levels, but actually what's it really like to be here? And I think that's quite challenging for most of us to be able to do that, because I'm not Cara and she's not me. So actually, how do we have that conversation in a way that's really productive? And how do you do that across an organisation that's got 3,000 staff and they're scattered potentially globally? You know, those are quite challenging questions for us. So I don't think any of us have got it completely right.
Just another little addendum to this. I studied some sociology as my degree, but I'm not a sociologist. There's a famous piece of sociological work about the presentation of self in everyday life by Erving Goffman that talks about front stage and backstage. And, you know, the more senior the leadership position, the greater the distance between front stage and backstage. And I think to be authentic, it's about connecting front and backstage so that, you know, you in leadership positions are not two different people in those sets of circumstances. There has to be something that rings true and is the same, whether you're on front stage, occasions like this, or whether it's backstage, you know, the difficult one-to-one with the direct report or with our chair of governors or whoever it is. And I think, you know, bringing that together is as important as bringing the global and the local together. So it's that merging of scales and bringing the connections.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Gentleman here, can we get the microphone? Thank you.
Mo Hanafi, Vice President of Education from the Cardiff University Students' Union. Just a quick question to all of you, please. I'm not in a position yet where I lead a lot of people, but hopefully one day I will be. And my question is sort of around, I'm sure in every organisation you have people who are well dedicated and are very enthusiastic and take initiative in doing the best that they can. So how do you sort of get around making sure that everyone has that kind of approach? I'm sure that you're all dedicated members and you all have initiative, and how do you make sure that the unengaged, in a sense, are just as dedicated as you are, I guess?
So I think it comes back to two things. First of all, from my experience, if you just expect them to behave as you do, it's not going to work, because actually they're different to you and they will have different approaches to things. I think this is where we're back to the question of values and expectations of behaviour. Again, in my experience, just driving people hard by metrics, you get some unintended consequences. You know, Volkswagen and the emission stuff is a really salient example for us. So I think it is about developing the team around you and the team around that individual, that actually you have sufficient peer engagement, that the expectations of what we're trying to do and ways that we can do it are actually valued, and you're letting people be creative, but you're also not letting people go so far off track that either they're frustrated because you're not taking things forward, or actually they're wasting time.
So Mo, I'd say on that one, you're not going to get everyone, and maybe in a very small organisation, 5 or 6 maybe, but you know, anything as it gets bigger, you're going to have call it 10% who are the zealot, you know, they're really there, they're going to be the cheerleaders, and you're going to have 10% who, it doesn't matter what you do or say, you're not going to change them. And it's the people in the middle then that you really need to be focusing on. And how do you do that? I don't know if it's really 10%, could be a bit more or less, you know, that sort of thing. But the people in the middle, you want to get that 80% as big as possible. And the way you do that, I think, is clearly communicate where you want to go with the organisation in a way that everyone can get. We heard that before about, you know, we're here to put a man on the moon. That's what we've got to do. Quite simple. So you think about how you contribute to that. So, and it's got to be something that is credible, so that people do have confidence it can be done, and that you're going to help make it happen. And you know, I'm going to help make it happen. I want you to help make it happen as well. And as long as you get enough people, that will do.
Very quickly, I think in large organisations, and you know, some of our organisations are very large, high performance is about teams, not individuals. And it's about working out how people can best contribute to the team. And in my experience, I mean, perhaps I'm naive, I'm still focused on the 100%, because I absolutely believe that nobody comes to work to do a bad job. Everybody wants to make a contribution. Not everybody does, but we have a responsibility to help those people work out why they're not making a contribution. And, you know, sometimes they will never make a contribution, and that's about helping people to move on and find other organisations and other environments, and that can actually be a positive outcome. It doesn't have to be a negative outcome. But I've seen some wonderful cases of people that I felt were really quite disengaged, but they were disengaged in the role they had at that time. And when they moved to a different role, it was like I saw a different person. So I would still be committed to working with people to try and find their place in the team so that they can come to work and deliver the good job that they feel they want to deliver.
Okay, thank you. We have a lady there for a question.
Thank you. Olwen Mosley, I'm the Dean of the School of Art and Design in Cardiff Metropolitan University. My question is going back to something that somebody mentioned, which was the honest conversation. And I've just discovered something called radical candour. I don't know whether anyone else in the room has, but fantastic TED talk. We're trying to introduce it and live it. One of the implications of helping people improve is that as a manager or a leader, you start from the top, and so you invite criticism, you embrace criticism, you ask for criticism, you don't let it go, you keep asking until somebody finds something critical to say about you. Now, somebody mentioned this, we're trying it out at the moment. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, you've done such a great job at being positive and focusing on the positive all the time. Are you sure at this moment you want to ask people to focus on the negative? And that's the question, really. What are the dangers of inviting a criticism?
Oh, it could go horribly wrong, obviously. So I think the most important thing that people are not afraid to, that people feel able to be critical, or at least to engage critically in some way, and not I mean, if you do surround yourself with people who disagree with you all the time, who just agree with you all the time, then you've got a problem. I mean, it is very important that people feel able to speak freely within reason, I mean, I think because everyone's got feelings as well. I mean, if I don't know what radical candour is, but I can guess it's something quite radical and candid, I suppose, which sounds a bit scary to me. I mean, I could imagine how you'd have to be pretty resilient if that went too far. So I think it should be managed carefully, but absolutely I welcome it when people say, well, what about this, what about that, because if that doesn't happen and you all get into groupthink, then you're really not going to get where you want to get.
And whilst the radical candour, I think it's actually the other way around. Actually, my experience of radical candour is you being honest as a leader about where you are and what you're doing. That's the radical candour that I've found from research. So staying with the theme of, if you're not open to hearing some of those voices, then how can you expect other people in the organisation to be open to it? So there is a role model. It is scary. We've just gone through it, and I think there has to be a respect in this. So, Colin's raised about, I guess it needs to be done with some kindness, because we are, at the end of the day, all human beings. And what you don't want is somebody saying, well, that's it, I'll just pack up my bags because this is awful. Because the reality is it will never be that bad. Actually, there are always, degrees of things you've been doing and things that you can modify that actually will make it better. So I would say kindness is probably the word I'd use in terms of taking this forward.
I think, Owen, that kind of radical candour, I love that term, I'm going to use it from now on, is really important in environments where you're trying to stimulate innovation. Because I think there was some research just completed by Google, a massive piece of research of something like 180 to 200 of their teams, looking at what is it that creates high-performing teams. And of course, they came up with a list of about 8 factors, and the single most important was that the team members in these, and they were fairly senior teams, the team members felt able to be honest and vulnerable in front of other team members. And if you're not able to do that, I don't think you can be innovative, because actually you're being defensive, you're on the back foot, and we've all had members of staff that tell you everything's fine, and you know it's not fine, and you actually can't help them unless they open up and tell you that they need help or this isn't working, and you can work through it together. And it doesn't have to be the person reporting to you. It might be me saying to someone, this isn't working for me. How can you help me to make this work?
I don't know what your experiences have been, but I think it is very, very challenging for senior leaders because you are out and about a fair bit. I probably spend 40% of my time elsewhere, overseas, in the UK, on other boards, talking to the cabinet secretary, whatever it may be. I try and spend 40% of my time seeing what's happening in the university. So actually the amount of time for that, because when you're out in the university, it's a bit like the Queen visiting in my case. You know, there is a, you know, it's pretty hard for most people. They do expect to organise the visits and to see things. So in that window where there is an opportunity for people to be honest with you, actually you really do have to engender it. And I think I failed in that. It's one of my resolutions going forward that I enable those open conversations more with kindness, because absolutely we won't be able to move forward. We won't be able to challenge ourselves sufficiently unless we're having those candid conversations.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, crikey, a few hands up now. So perhaps we'll take a couple of questions at the same time. So can we get a microphone? Yep. Start with the lady on the end there.
Hi, Helen Langton, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of South Wales. So you've talked about authentic leadership. Would you say that the more senior you have become as a leader, you've actually had to be not only more vulnerable, but show that vulnerability more in order to be authentic? Don't mind who answers.
Thank you. And another question there.
Alison Phillips, Governor at University of South Wales. My question was around the transferability of leadership skills between sectors, maybe a test of the appetite to lead a local authority or to lead a PLC from the panel.
Okay, thank you. And the final question, I saw a hand up at the back there. Thanks, Rita. Give you some time to think.
Hello there, I'm Catherine Harper. I'm shortly to be Deputy Vice-Chancellor at University of Chichester. And my question was, inevitably there are times when we have to somewhat change direction or, having made a decision, think whether that has to be revised or changed. And I'd be really interested to know what your perspective is on the change of decisions or how that gets handled. Thanks.
Okay, to summarise then, so the first question was around authentic leadership, and the more senior you get, do you have to become more real or more authentic or sort of give more of yourself? Second one was on transferability of leadership between sectors, and the last one I've just summarised as no U-turns, just to quote a famous politician from a few years ago.
Shall I start? I'll do them in reverse order, I think. That question about changing your mind or changing a decision, we all have to face it at times, and sometimes in a very sort of public way. It happened to me in Essex once. You'll be surprised to hear over car parking. It's an uncontentious matter, where we just basically got it wrong, essentially had to back down and say, we've got this wrong, we're going to take it back again. And of course then you do get the triumphalism and so on, which is extremely irritating, because you know that whole business that when you actually listen to people and take account of what's being said and then change your mind, you're told, well, you've given way and caved in. So that, you know, it's a pity that, because it does make it more difficult to do, but it's absolutely critical. I think there's a great book by Anthony King and Ivor Crewe, my predecessor at Essex, called The Blunders of Our Governments. And it used to be, I think it was originally cock-ups, but they had to change that for the title. And it's really about how you, when you've done something like the poll tax, at what point do you realise you need to row back on that? And I think it is just, well, first of all, you've got to be prepared to do it. You know, you have to be prepared to do it. If you're not, that way disaster lies. And then it's a judgment of when you do it, and is it the right thing to row back? And I think, you know, clearly you can think of many cases where governments persisted and Mrs. Thatcher was brought down by that one. on the other hand, David Cameron perhaps rode back too much. You know, he seemed to change his mind every 5 minutes in the first 2 minutes of the 2 years of the coalition. He'd make a decision, and then 6 weeks later, it would all be rescinded again. And then people think, you know, well, so what's going on here? So I think that is really, you've got to be prepared to do it, but you need to make a judgment. In terms of leading other sectors, that's really an interesting one. I haven't seen many vice-chancellors do this, and I think it's a bit annoying, because why not? You know, because we're always getting people from other sectors coming in and telling us they could lead our universities, and sometimes do, and that's fine. And, you know, it sometimes works. But it rarely happens in the opposite direction. I don't think that's necessarily for want of trying. So I think that there would be potential there, depending on what I suppose the sector is. But I've certainly had a captain of industry, heard a captain of industry, you know, who actually takes companies, buys them up, turns them around, sells them on, say that, you know, he's met people in the university world who could do this. So, you know, who knows, maybe that'll happen one time. And then the first question about the more senior you are, the more vulnerable you have to be. Well, not more vulnerable you have to be, but that you need to. That is more of a necessity of showing it. I don't think I'd use the word vulnerable, but necessarily, or that could be part of it. But I think that the more senior you become, the more distant you are, and the more people see you via the role that you inhabit. You know, they see you at a distance, and they see the impression you make, and people do stop really seeing you as a person. So, if it's not about vulnerability, although it could be, certainly humanity, and really that was the point I was trying to make, that it's so important to let that, it's find ways that are not going to undermine confidence, but will actually help create confidence that you are a person who's really doing their best, you know, like anybody would be, to get this right, and that you are listening, but you're aware that you do have a role to maintain, and you cannot speak freely necessarily in public as you would if you didn't have that role. So that really is the tightrope that you walk.
I'll probably take the question of, so I have worked in other sectors, and I echo your comments. I think compared to the United States higher education system, where you do see a lot more movement around, we don't, and I think it's something perhaps as leaders in higher education we ought to challenge a bit more and question a bit more, because I really don't think it happens. Having said that, I think there is a sort of experience, and I don't mean experience of leadership, but leadership of what we're trying to do. I mean, one of our new board members asked me today about, you know, my move into higher education. I mean, it is the most rewarding sector I think I've ever worked in, because it transforms people's lives. You know, we say it glibly, but it really does. And to be honest with you, you know, my first environment, precision engineering, it was nice, but you know, it didn't quite turn you on the same way when you're talking about, you know, can we make sure that mortuary rack works properly? It's not quite the same. Second question about vulnerability. Again, it's a topic that I'd echo your comments about, you know, the difficulty of it. My own personal experience is actually, as I've got more senior, I've had to show more of the real me. Until I became Vice-Chancellor, I don't think I ever showed anything of my personal life in my role, in my professional roles. So going so far that at one point my child was desperately ill in hospital. I chaired an award board and nobody knew my child was desperately ill in hospital. And you know, now I could not do that. First of all, my team around me need to know, because actually if the hospital ring, they need to get me out what I'm doing. But I think it's important for the organisation to realise that you are the leader, but you are a leader that actually has humanity. And that family values are really important. You know, my mum, you know, the care home rang for my mum, and actually I had to drop what I was doing and go. So I would want everybody in the organisation to feel that if that happened to them, the organisation would support them doing that. And then I've forgotten the third question. You've written it. Oh yeah. Oh, you have to do it, but give yourself wiggle room would be my tip on this one. You know, the reality is nobody can predict the future. Colin said it. So actually, you know, admit sometimes if you've got things wrong. I think the candour works incredibly well if you're honest about, we didn't get that right because of X, Y, Z, and we've learnt this from this. But you know, give yourself a bit of wiggle room if you can, because that way you don't have to keep doing U-turns.
Very briefly on 2 out of the 3, the no U-turns, I actually think sometimes it's quite useful to make, and I wouldn't define it as a U-turn because I see it much more as a kind of process of communication where you can show that you have been listening and that perhaps you didn't have all the answers at the beginning. But I think even before that, lesson I learned pretty early was try to avoid those strong, swift, sure and wrong decisions. So the ones that are made in haste, you know, which actually don't serve you well because people don't feel that they've been listened to. So I try to avoid those kind, and then you probably don't make lots of U-turns, but very occasional reversals of decisions where you can make it obvious that you're reversing the decision because you have listened. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The more senior, the more authentic, yes, absolutely. And I think it's this front stage, backstage thing, that the more the distance, the more conscious you are of it, the more you actually have to do things consciously to overcome that distance. An outing moment. I was really struck yesterday. I arrived at work, my first day at Cardiff Met, and on my desk there was an envelope, and I thought, oh, I wonder what's in this envelope. And I thought, looks like it's going to be a card. And it was a card from Cardiff Met's LGBT plus staff group. And I thought, this is wonderful. I spent the first 10 years of my career hiding my sexuality for fear that I'd never be promoted. And here I was, and I actually laughed out loud. It was just such a wonderful moment. And I kind of wanted to run around the university waving this very colourful card. So, you know, I felt that I could be sufficiently authentic to, you know, not to hide that, not to publicise it, but not to hide it. And I think that's really important. And it's been really important for many members of staff and students. And I saw that not just yesterday, but also in my previous institution. So I've been a VC in a much smaller institution for the last 3.5 years. That distance between front and backstage is less. It was really important to show support to staff and students in that humane way. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I think we're out of time for questions, so I'd like to thank you for your candour. And before we go backstage, I'd like to hand over to Alison.
So I've been briefed here to sum up in 3 short points, and I just think that's an impossible task, but it's been a fabulous, fabulous series of presentations. And as I sat listening, I just thought, this reminds me why I work in higher education and why I'm here 25 years on. And I feel inspired by the leadership stories I've heard today. Thank you so much. And you've all brought a real human element. And I've taken away things like authenticity and calmness and perception. I never thought I'd take away a touch of Buzz Lightyear, actually. And I think all of you have got a touch of Buzz Lightyear in there. This idea of, you know, a sense of purpose and vulnerability. And if I wanted to ask a question, I think great leaders do seek feedback. One of my mantras is never stop wanting to hear the bad news. Still hurts, and I'd like to ask you how you deal with that, so I'll ask you about that over drinks. And then this whole thing about the tensions between coherence and quality and embracing diversity and living your values all at the same time. Like, wow. Anyway, I think you've given us lots of really helpful tips. Thank you very much. And we look forward to talking to you more over the reception, which is now to follow. So I won't get between you and the food and drinks, but there are some thanks that I have to say. We were absolutely delighted that the musicians from the University of South Wales arranged for us. Thank you very much, through your office, Julie. From the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama out there. Aren't they fabulous? I thought absolutely amazing. They'll be playing for us. And I'd also like to thank the team at the LF who have spent a long time getting this all organised so smoothly. So there's Tricia Wombell, Louise Clifton, Michael McCulley, Sophia, who's in London, but nonetheless working hard, and Gary, of course, who's fabulous Welsh, kicked us off this evening. He saved me from doing that. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Gemma Cole and Emma Darling at the University of Cardiff for their patience with us and their perseverance as we were putting this together and the whole evening. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for all of your questions. Please come and join us for some more drinks and canapes and conversation outside. Thank you.